Hello everyone. It began with the rain, soft at first, then relentless, hammering rooftops, pounding farmland, filling rivers. By midnight, it had turned deadly. Torrents roared down valleys, rivers burst through their banks, and the land gave way. In West Sumatra's Tanah Datar regencies, entire neighborhoods were swallowed. Streets became rivers in hours, bridges collapsed like twigs, and farmland, rice, corn, vegetables disappeared under waves of mud. Survivors described the terror: fast-moving water slamming into homes, sweeping away motorcycles, cars, entire buildings. Families jolted awake in darkness, the sound of rain replaced by the roar of destruction. Mothers clutched their children, fleeing barefoot into waist-deep water. Some never escaped. Those caught in the night flood had seconds to act. Too many had none. By morning, whole towns were half drowned, and what had once been life was now a ghostly swamp of rooftops and debris. The terror was not just the flood, it was the realization that safety had vanished overnight. In Brazil, watching from afar, people fell silent. Their own swollen rivers, their own fragile valleys flickered in their minds. The terror in Indonesia was their terror too. With dawn came grief. At least 67 confirmed dead, 20 still missing. Each name a story, each body a wound. In families gathered on riverbanks as rescuers carried out the drowned wrapped in white cloth. In Tanah Datar, children wept for classmates swept away in the night. "We were caught off guard," survivors whispered. Grief spread like a second flood, heavier than water, pulling down spirits. It was not just people lost, farmland drowned, livestock gone, livelihoods erased. For many, the grief of losing their homes was compounded by the grief of losing their futures. Mosques lay half buried in mud, their prayer calls silenced. Markets vanished under water, their stalls reduced to driftwood. One mother described clinging to her child as water slammed into her home. Her neighbors, she said, were swept away before her eyes. In shelters, people sat hollow-eyed, staring at muddy clothes and scraps of memory. Across Brazil, television screens carried these images, and Brazilians felt the grief in their bones. This was not only Indonesia's grief. It was grief that belonged to every nation vulnerable to storms. But grief could not be indulged for long. Urgency took over. More than 4,000 people fled to temporary shelters, schools and halls, packed with families, blankets and fear. Emergency responders, joined by volunteers, launched rescue operations despite roads buried under debris. Drones flew over rivers, searching for movement on rooftops. Excavators cleared mudslides to open paths to trapped villages. Boats ferried the stranded across violent currents, yet every hour brought new challenges. Continued rain, blocked roads, more missing persons. Hunger crept into shelters where rice and bottled water were rationed. Overcrowding sparked fears of disease, diarrhea, cholera, waterborne sicknesses that thrive when sanitation collapses. Medical staff moved frantically from patient to patient, exhausted but unwilling to stop. The urgency was not only physical survival. It was psychological, to keep hope alive when the world had turned into mud and silence. In Brazil, this urgency felt familiar. Their own floods had taught them the same lesson. When water rises, survival becomes a race against time. In the wreckage, resilience began to bloom. Neighbors opened homes to those who had none. Volunteers carried boxes of food through knee-deep mud, setting up community kitchens where fires burned and soup was shared among strangers. Children in shelters were given makeshift toys, teachers tutoring them on blackboards salvaged from drowned schools. Soldiers cleared roads, rescuers pumped water from streets, and medical teams built field hospitals. Aid flowed in: food, blankets, medicine. Families who had lost everything shared what little they had left. "We have no choice," said one farmer. "We help each other, or we die." And so, step by step, hope began to flicker through despair. Indonesia had been struck, but it refused to bow. Brazil, watching, felt a surge of awe. They too had seen resilience in their floods and landslides, but seeing it rise from Indonesia's mud was a reminder of the unbreakable human spirit. Yet even as resilience shone, despair lingered. Rain clouds loomed again. Meteorologists warned of more storms, more floods. In shelters, whispers spread, "What if the waters return?" Trauma hung heavy. Children startled at every thunderclap. Mothers woke from dreams of drowning. Disease was no longer a distant fear, but a real threat as shelters overflowed. Aid, though plentiful at first, stretched thin as days turned to weeks. Fields remained waterlogged, livestock gone, livelihoods lost. The despair was not loud, it was ghostly, silent, lingering in the eyes of survivors who stared at the ruins of their homes and whispered, "How do we begin again?" Across Brazil, that despair struck deep. They had felt it before. After floods, after landslides, after promises of safety that failed. They knew it would begin. Indonesia's despair was Brazil's warning. The floodwaters of Indonesia reached Brazil not as waves, but as images, ghostly, chilling, unforgettable. In Sao Paulo, Rio and Manaus, people watched footage of drowned villages, washed-out bridges, grieving families. And they asked the same question: what if this happens to us? Brazil has rivers swollen by deforestation, valleys eroded by poor land management, dams strained by age. They too face storms stronger than before, rains heavier, seasons unpredictable. Indonesia's tragedy was not a distant disaster. It was a mirror, a ghostly reflection of what Brazil might face if warnings are ignored. And in that mirror, Brazilians saw their own fragile homes, their own families clinging to rooftops, their own children lost to rivers. The shock was not pity, but dread.